So before we get started, we actually wanted to kind of gauge our audience, figure out who's in the room today. So we know that there are some students and there are some working professionals. So whether you're a student or a working professional, if you're a student, you can speak to your past background. But we wanted to just get a sense of the sectors. So public sector, working in government, private sector, working for corporations or for-profit organizations, and then social sector, nonprofits and foundations. So can we just get a show of hands? Who here is working in the public sector? Excellent, wonderful, great to have you. Who here is working in the corporate sector? Wonderful, very good, helpful, good data. And who is working in the social sector, nonprofits, foundations? Awesome. Okay, thank you, that's really helpful. So it seemed like it was about a third, maybe a little bit more in the private sector, but really it sounds like we're a really good mix, so that's awesome. We also wanted to know who in this room considers themselves an activist. Show of hands. Oh, all right, more than we expected. Excellent. So activism is a topic that some of us can relate to and some of us can't, but a definition of activism we thought would be helpful as grounding. One definition of an activist is someone who takes actions to catalyze, encourage, or bring about change, and in order to elicit social, cultural, or political transformations. So given that definition, trying to create transformation, who in this room considers themselves an activist? Okay, a few more people, great. So I'm Sara Cantor Aye. I am the co-founder and ED of Greater Good Studio. I would love to start by kind of having our panelists introduce themselves, and we're going to introduce ourselves in this way. As we know, our conference is called Design Intersections, so we'd love to hear from each of you, who you are, what you do, and specifically, what are some of the disciplines that design intersects with in your work. So if you are designers, or at least partially designers, but you do other things, or there are other people that you work with on a daily basis, we would love to have that context when we understand how each of you is working in design. So would anyone like to start, or should I call on you? The one with the microphone. We're sending it to Jorge.
I think this is on, yes. Thank you, Sara. My name is Jorge Camacho. I'm coming from Mexico City. I work probably in the intersection of three different fields. I work as a research affiliate at Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, but mostly doing work in Latin America, in Mexico and Costa Rica currently, around the future of education and work. I also work as an independent consultant in strategic design and foresight, working with some private companies and public organizations in Mexico around service and systems and design, always with a focus on foresight. And I'm also a lecturer in a couple of universities to design postgraduate programs, teaching systems thinking to designers and also foresight to designers. So I would probably just sum up by saying that I work in the intersection between design, foresight, and systems thinking.
Thank you, Jorge.
Good morning. Hi, I'm Eleanor Gorski, and I work for the Department of Planning and Development here in Chicago. I'm happy to say I've been a public servant for over 20 years here in the city. But before that, I was trained and licensed as an architect. That was really important for me to get out of the way before doing other things in my career. And also to have that basis in talking with developers, architects, community groups, and to really understand the technical issues faced on the various projects that we deal with at the Department of Planning. So where I started is really working in the neighborhoods as an architect, and I loved it. Working in historic districts with community groups throughout the city, and I really got to understand many neighborhoods in the city and working hands-on with the challenges that we face here. But then working in the department, I've been able to be exposed to tax increment financing and I was formerly the Bureau Chief for Planning, Sustainability, and Historic Preservation. I was just asked by Mayor Lightfoot to take over as acting commissioner for the time being as they kind of organize themselves. Thank you. So I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm really excited to bring some of the ideas that we'll be discussing this morning to the wider city. Thank you.
Thank you, and you can hold on to that, I believe. Is there a second microphone? There's not. Okay, Paola.
You're ambitious, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. Buenos dias. My name is Paola Aguirre. I'm an architectural and urban designer. I'm founder of BORDERLESS Studio. And I'm originally from a town and state called Chihuahua in northern Mexico. So my fellow Mexican patriot. The joke in our family is now I cannot move from Chicago because then I wouldn't be between Chi-towns, Chicago and Chihuahua. So I'm committed to Chicago. That's just to say I have to stay here. And I'm really excited to be here and hear from the other panelists. I also come from public service, Eleanor. The first job after architecture school that I was able to get in my hometown was working for government. We had no idea what we were doing. We were a small, young planning agency working in municipal planning, but I think the DNA of public service and community service was very fundamental in my formation as a young designer. Came to the US, worked for design corporate world, got a lot of experience working for Skidmore, Owens & Merrill, doing planning internationally, globally, cities in Asia and Europe. So that was a really great, solid experience. Later working for University of Chicago and this experiment called Place Lab that artist Theaster Gates was putting together a couple of years ago. So imagine working for the public in one stage of my career, then working globally, looking at cities from 10,000 feet from above, master planning for new cities completely in Asia and China especially, and then working side by side with committee members on the ground. So I had to go from like different scales and therefore in different publics. Therefore the name of my practice, Borderless. Like I realized I was not going to find a place where all these scales and topics work together. So might as well try to build a platform for that. So a lot of the work that I do, it's rooted in this idea of cultivating collaborative design agency. I practice horizontally between arts, architecture, landscape architecture, urban design, urban planning, civic participatory processes, so all that at once, which is very exciting but also very challenging. So I'm excited to speak more about that today with everyone here.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Oh, I think so. I'm Steve Babitch. I am currently a Presidential Innovation Fellow in Washington, D.C. I started under the Obama administration, and the Fellows Program was started in 2012 when Todd Park, a Silicon Valley entrepreneur who was the CTO of the United States at the time, got the ear of President Obama and said, let's try an experiment where we bring in Silicon Valley-like talent, but design, data science, tech, into government, work with federal agencies to modernize government and make it more effective. In the first year of the program, you all remember healthcare.gov blowing up. The president did not look good in the beginning, and Todd Park grabbed a few of the fellows, a couple others, and said, get in there and fix it. And they did, and made the cover of Time magazine. And so doing that kind of, using these kinds of skill sets and talent is what the Fellows Program is about. Since then, the U.S. Digital Service has been founded, as well as 18F, and we are here to basically do good for government, good for citizen work, period, regardless of administration. So I am detailed to the FBI, and the work is around how can the FBI work with industry, private industry, to stay ahead of threats and mitigate the wide range of attacks that occur. And I could share a little bit more about that, but that has to do with information sharing, which sounds like an innocuous, like not a major issue, but there are real challenges for why that happens less effectively than it can. At the same time, I work with the World Bank on the side, doing sort of design, bringing that into the bank, which traditionally is quite a top-down organization in terms of execution of projects. We're trying to do sort of multi-stakeholder approaches on early-stage ventures and helping different countries adapt to climate change. So work with lots of different people. On the FBI side, agents, analysts in national security, criminal issues, senior officials up and down the chain of command. And then in the World Bank, agronomists, economists, ministries, governments, a wide range as well, entrepreneurs. So that's the short version.
Wow, thank you. And thank you, all of you. I just want to take a moment to say these are designers who are doing really beyond design kinds of things. Stephen's like, yeah, you know, I also work for the World Bank on the side, no big thing. Paola's like, I integrate these 6 disciplines every day. Eleanor's like, yeah, I'm just running the Department of Planning, but you know, I'm an architect at heart. Jorge's like, I know the future. Like, these are important roles, and these are roles that kind of come from design, but they go so far beyond design. Amazing, you guys are amazing. So designers have wanted to make impact for as long as designers have existed, right? But usually the way that designers are kind of used to make impact is on businesses or economies. We can sort of build new markets or, you know, even entirely new industries. These guys are kind of proving that there's a different way to make impact as a designer on organizations, on communities, on society. And I'm really inspired by the work that you all do. I wanted to ask about kind of transformation, because this is sort of, as I mentioned, the kind of definition of an activist is someone working to catalyze transformation, a social transformation, perhaps a cultural transformation, a political one. I would love for each of you to tell us about a transformation that you are working towards. It could be really big, it could be really small, it could be within your own team, or it could be at the scale of our country. But tell us about the kinds of transformations that you are really looking to catalyze. And who has the mic?
Now we have 2. Yes. Well, I guess I can start, and I'll keep it brief because I want to get into the dialogue part too. But oftentimes in thinking of like activism and transformation, the first question that I ask myself is like, for whom? I think that for whom, it's a very important part of my thought process, like who are we doing this for? And then kind of also reflecting on that part, I tend to lead with this idea of designing with and not for. So like in my own thought process, I'm already contradicting myself, right? But that kind of thinking comes every time I engage in a project. And that's a premise just to tell you a little bit of a side project that I've been working on for 2 years, over 2 years and a half now. And it's related to the 2013 closings of schools. As many of you might know, City of Chicago closed close to 50 schools in 2013. And I learned about this late. I learned about it in 2015, and my reaction as this very compulsive, research-driven person as well was, I just want to understand the information. I just want to understand the data. I want to visualize it. I just want to make this relevant, because even though they had been 2 years after the school's closings, I wasn't seeing enough conversation. So my first instinct was, how can I use my design skills of visualization to bring awareness about a topic that I thought it was important to talk about? Information visualization reaches its limits really quick, especially with the question of the for, like who I was doing this for. So I was able to write, to publish in a few magazines, and then not enough conversation was still going on. So I learned about this almost 50 schools, documented them, created a platform, internet communications channel. You can find a lot of that work in creativegrounds.org. But then I had this need, this instinct that I needed to do something on the ground. Again, this idea of scales. and started reaching out while understanding the process in which the schools were being transitioned from a public asset to a private building property. I started reaching out to the folks that were buying the schools, just understanding this process of asset transformation. A lot of doors were knocked, like, hey, I want to understand what is this idea of transformation of a public asset into a private building or a private amenity. A lot of doors were not closed, were not open. So finally, someone opened the door. I met Gian Format at the Washington Park Development Group, who owns Overton Elementary in Bronzeville, located on 49th and Indiana. And talked to him about the value of, well, in addition to learning about his plans to transform this former school, 60,000 square feet of building, the idea of looking into an incubator about technology and businesses in the middle of Bronzeville. It was super interesting to me. And then the plans of redevelopment were a little bit far ahead, so I wanted to understand what was the value on the timeline in between. The timeline in between the school had been closed, the timeline between the school being open, again, as something else. So I saw value in that specific time frame, and started to thinking about strategies to activate the school, more with the intent of like building relationships that were disrupted. Schools are incredible amenities. Yes, they offer spaces for education, but also they're places where relationships are cultivated. So I wanted to hold the ground for that. And we've been doing a series of activations over 2 years, bringing design and art as an excuse, creativity, to reimagine or at least ask the question of like, what's the future of social infrastructure? I just don't think there's enough conversation about the future of social infrastructure, the future starting tomorrow all the way until, the next 100 years. So I'm gonna leave it there and just premise that.
Thank you so much. And I know that often when we think about the future, we think of longer time frames, but kids are in school right now. They're not going to be kids forever. So sometimes we can't wait. We have to move right now. Thank you. Who would like to share? Eleanor, yeah. What transformation are you working towards?
So there are so many, as you guys know from the recent campaign, so many issues that need to be tackled in the city. And I would say the one that I'm most excited about to work with my colleagues with at the city would be the affordable housing issues that our city's facing. And the reason why I'm excited about this very, very difficult issue is that for so long, our Department of Housing was a vehicle to simply get out programs, to provide financing, to figure out how to build projects. And there wasn't a planning or design lens necessarily informing a lot of the decision making or even a community planning effort. And I think as this problem becomes more recognized in the city and in all neighborhoods, that this is an issue that we need to approach more systematically. And I'm excited to have the Department of Planning assist our colleagues at the new Department of Housing through data-driven research as to where affordable housing is needed, the size of affordable housing, helping to rewrite our affordable requirements ordinance to be more, all-encompassing, but yet also have the flexibility to deal with the particular needs in individual neighborhoods. And I think that's going to be the challenge from a city planning perspective, and especially from this administration, to ensure that we do meet the needs of individual neighborhoods, but yet there's an equity and a fairness throughout the entire city. So that's going to be a difficult balancing act, but I'm excited by the challenge, and I know we have a good team and we have good practitioners, and as the mayor did, I will call upon all of you to assist with that in your individual fields.
Thank you.
Let's see. The cultural transformation. I think on the FBI side, there's a when you spend your career in the FBI, that means you have not spent your career in industry, yet you have to find ways to work with industry in order to stay ahead and mitigate threats, because companies are victims of a wide range of attacks, cybercrime, active shooters, theft of intellectual property is a huge issue. And bridging the divide between those two different skill sets, mindsets, worldviews. I think worldviews, Alyssa might have brought up this notion of having different worldviews, clinicians and non. I think that's a big part of where design and that empathy, emotional intelligence comes in to really bridge that divide, and I've had to do that very much so in understanding. First, I'm not an FBI agent. I've never spent any time in real security space, but I had to go in there and they're looking at me with healthy skepticism and quite a bit of skepticism in the beginning. Who are you as a designer who's going to come in here and tell me what my job is when I've been an agent for 10 years, 20 years? But I had to deeply understand what the world that they live in every day, and it's not a very pretty world. And then understand the dynamics of information sharing and how that happens with industry and others, and do the same on the industry side. What are the challenges and issues in information on both sides? And there are real problems, and I'll give you a couple specific examples. One, the FBI is concerned about sharing too much information because they don't want to reveal classified information. They don't want to reveal the source and method by which that information is obtained. If that were to happen, that can be very problematic, particularly for individuals who are those sources. That's life-threatening in some instances. They also don't want to compromise an ongoing investigation. On the industry side, they're concerned about sharing trade secrets accidentally, PII, personally identifiable information, user information, that's of paramount importance to many companies. And so that prevents more proactive sharing. And then if that doesn't happen, things happen, a catastrophic event or a theft or you name it. And you wonder, how can we do this more effectively? And so the role of design in that world is, can we at least sit down at the same table and start to work through these things in a different way, different approach? And by doing that, we've been able to actually bridge a lot of those divides and misperceptions and make progress on matters of national security and criminal threats. Violent crimes against children is just one issue, but there are others. I just say on the World Bank side, it's more in like help in convening. Similarly, the bank is very top down, but when you bring bank people to the world of entrepreneurs who are trying to help small and family farmers in Brazil, you see what the real challenges are, and it's not just execute this program. It's the reason why these programs don't work sometimes is because there's a lack of trust between farmers and entrepreneurs. They don't want some tech entrepreneur ruining their crop. And so let's try to delve deeply and see what's happening at that ground level, and then we'll actually start somewhere specific. So, we can use the buzzwords lean, agile design, but start somewhere and get it right and then expand from there. So that to me is the value of design in this context.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a common misperception that designers, folks might think design is about designers, and it's definitely not about designers. It's definitely about the people who we are serving, whether that's FBI agents or corporate sector stakeholders. Those are the people that we are designing for, and that can often be a helpful tool to kind of disarm and move past that trust barrier, which is often quite high.
Absolutely, and we have to be design-centric with the clients that we serve, because designers are like, well, they don't understand the process. Well, you have to go where they are, right? If you really want to be truly empathic, it's not just the end user or the other, it's the client that you're working with as well. So
yeah, all the users of a solution. Jorge, what transformation are you working towards?
So one of the things that I've been thinking about over the last few days and weeks, due to the opportunity to participate in this panel, is why, and I probably some of you felt it when Sara asked who considers themselves as activists. And one of the reasons why I personally feel that it feels like hard to say, yes, I'm an activist, is because I think there's two components. One is that for me, the term activist means to have the capacity or at least the will to initiate change. And very often, I mean, traditionally, designers, we play a role in society that is kind of more responsive. It's more normal for designers to receive briefs, to receive opportunities to work on some problems, to solve them, rather than to initiate kind of like a process of change. And then the second thing is that once you have the will to initiate that change, there needs to be someone else to kind of follow you and to actually continue that change. So, and I'm gonna give an example of something recent where I tried to play that role and not necessarily kind of like succeeded, which of course I think it's part of the reality of trying to be an activist, right? So perhaps you remember a couple of years ago in September of 2017, we had a big earthquake in Mexico City, and this was not, of course, the first time. One of the really interesting, and back then I was working as a head of strategy in a design studio called Uncommon. And we had been working with, private clients and government organizations in, like regular product service design projects. And so the earthquake happened in September, and we were supposed to present a project, like another really different thing around futures, as part of a festival that takes place every year in Mexico City called Abierto Mexicano Diseño, like an open design festival. But then the earthquake hits Mexico City in September, and really two interesting things started to happen. One of them was that there was, as usually happens, not only in Mexico, but in places where they are hit by some kind of disaster like that, is that, of course, people get together to help each other and try to solve things. So this was, again, the response in Mexico, and really wonderful citizen mobilization to help each other. But what we found really interesting is that then, a few days after the earthquake, people started to feel what usually happens is that things start to go back to normal. And there were calls for people to actually, like almost like a slogan, to let's avoid getting back to normality. Because as part of, the disaster, people started also to realize and to be more aware of all the ways in which the city is very risky, very unsustainable, very unequal, and people perceived that perhaps the crisis was in some ways an opportunity to really kind of like more explicitly address those issues. And as part of the studio, we had been, by then, thinking a lot about the role of designers in sort of like driving these large-scale changes, and more specifically getting involved in this emerging movement around transition design. So we decided to change what we were about to present in the festival and change it to we basically designed a design toolkit to get people involved in projects around transformation of the city. So we developed this toolkit. We organized a few co-design and workshops, gathering different stakeholders, some people from the city, some people from the recently emerging activist networks, some experts that we try to gather from specific fields, and then people from particularly affected communities. So we held over a couple of days a series of workshops trying to think about the ways in which people could maintain kind of like the level of activism all the way up to thinking about long-term futures and transformation for the city. Of course, what happens is that we, being like just a few designers, we couldn't really avoid or manage to help people to not go back to normality. So eventually things went back to normal. We had to go back to, our work. And, but at least we sort of like seeded a few a few circles or groups of people, and we have been continued working. Obviously, with much smaller scale, we have a whole festival to work on that. But there's been a couple of groups and have continued to be involved. Also, that gave me the opportunity to become involved in more explicitly in the transition design movement globally. So I'm now in touch with a bunch of practitioners working on that, sharing, these challenges that we face when we try to work on these topics. And I think eventually I realized that perhaps what I could do, what was sort of like within my reach, was to try to perhaps not just directly try to affect change in something as challenging and daunting as transforming Mexico City, but actually to see the perspective and the frameworks and the knowledge around working as a designer in those types of challenges. So one of the ways in which I'm trying to continue this is through training other designers in transition design approaches and all the ways in which that involves getting designers to become more like activists. So that's that sort of thing.
Thank you so much. I heard a lot about the ways that each of us have sort of been able to kind of take some power, maybe more power than we were initially given in the design process. I think that designers often feel the limitations of our power, like, if only, the client would implement, or if only, there was money involved, ways to kind of keep our projects going. And at the same time, I think we actually have a lot more power than we give ourselves credit for in not only the design process, but that larger goal of change and transformation. I think it would be hard to talk about activism without talking about power. And so I want to kind of dig a little bit more into that. Many of us are working to achieve some type of social impact, and what that often looks like is a redistribution of power, right? It's maybe a rebalancing, not necessarily taking power away, but kind of regenerating and kind of growing the power of people who are in many cases underserved, marginalized, who are not having access to that power. And power looks many different ways. It can look like authority over a decision. It can look like, a voice in the process or agency to make a change yourself. What I'm curious about is, how each of you has worked to shift or to rebalance power in your work, and maybe what some of the challenges are in doing so. This is, that's something that happens whether you are a consultant or a client, whether you are working in an agency or a corporation, to say, let's give power perhaps to the end user, or let's at least consider the different ways that power can be shared in the design process. So I would love to know examples. I would also love to know challenges, because I'm definitely not trying to say that's easy, but it's an important goal. Eleanor.
Yeah, I'd like to start with this, if I may. In my job in city planning, I deal with a lot of different constituencies, and that can deal from an individual project basis all the way to a community planning process. So I'd like to talk about two different examples. As an architect, I often want to defend the architect's vision in projects. And one of the roles that I have at the Department of Planning is to review larger development projects that require plan development or zoning approval, and this is the design of these projects. And we've really tightened up that process to talk to the architects up front in the zoning process, talk about what their vision is, ask them for a vision statement, and actually codify that as part of the zoning application, as well as materials, details, things that were never thought of before, and that's for two reasons. To give the power back to the designer, frankly, and to ensure that the project can't be value engineered to the point where the designer and the community no longer recognizes it. And that can happen through the construction process. So in a small way, even in the administrative function that we serve at the Department of Planning, I feel like that gives power more to the process and to the designer than had been there previously. The second example I wanted to give is more of a community planning perspective. We've had a few very controversial big projects come through. Lincoln Yards is one of those. And it was very important from the very beginning to look at the entire neighborhood north of the city in preparation for these developers coming into the area and developing individual parcels. So in that way, we redistributed the power that had been in the hands of individual developers into the community first, so that their vision could be discussed and laid out in an overall plan for the area that then individual developers needed to fit within. And even within that planning process, it was also important to have community members, folks that own businesses, see each other in the same room and have a dialogue. I know that sounds kind of common sense, but that doesn't happen often. And it was really important for us to ensure that all of these different folks were in the room at the same time and understood each other, or even if they didn't understand, to at least hear each other, and then document that as a city agency. So hopefully empowering the community. And I would not say give power, I would say empower, because I think there was a vacuum there. So that's the process that we'd like to see continue throughout the city.
When you say there was a vacuum there, what do you mean?
I'm not sure. You know, I've been at this for a while, but I would say that in my experience with the city, that I haven't seen a lot of processes like that. And I think that that has resulted in the vacuum of good decision-making, good dialogue being filled by the zoning code or being filled by a developer's vision rather than being guided by the greater neighborhood or the community.
I see. Thank you. Thank you. So kind of distributing that empowerment, if you will. Thank you. Thank you. Others have stories they would like to share?
I mean, Eleanor brought up a really good point on just finding ways to get people in the same. Is that working? Yeah. Okay. Finding ways to get people in the same room together when sometimes tensions just really run high and frustrations are there. I actually view it. This is how I view it. I don't have power, and I will never have power in a place like the FBI, but I have influence. And because of what I've been able to do has grabbed the attention of not just agents and analysts, but all the way up to the director of the FBI. And it got their attention where I had the opportunity to brief Director Comey at the time and other senior officials. And that, because of how I engaged different stakeholders and that very much empathic approach and just getting their perspective, and then I'm folding industry's perspective into the FBI because it's not widely known. And given who we chose to meet with, which is of strategic importance to the Bureau for many reasons, that gathers the attention of senior officials in the Bureau and up all the way up and down the chain of command and gets people to say, oh, you were able to do that. And I wish I can get into specifics, it gets a little challenging, but having that ability to again, go out and sit with and observe security engineers, chief information security officers, the challenges of, I think Alyssa also mentioned the idea of like the different data format challenges of how health records and other documents are shared and data is shared. Same in the cybersecurity and security space. But understanding all of that, synthesizing it and folding it up to what matters to the FBI and putting it in terms that they understand, that's the influence. And then but that's not power. So that's just sort of how I view it in my experience.
I just asked Jorge before we started this panel, what's your superpower? Just funny to connect that. I won't tell you. I'll let him tell you if he wants. But it's really difficult for me to think about power without thinking of values. So for me, in many instances, what is missing in these conversations, whether it's community or high-level decision makers, is that there's never, as part of the process, designing the process, there's never opportunity to put those values out there and be transparent about them. So I was part of one of the transition committees recently for Mayor Lightfoot. And I was really impressed that the first thing we talked about was values. And like, yes, this is the table I want to be part of. And it's oftentimes, I'm not going to share a specific example, more so a framework. I always start with thinking or sharing values across. And I think that's a conversation or a part of the design process that has been undervalued and minimized. Let's talk about design values and principles. Because if we connect at that level, the rest follows. If we agree that transparency, equity, justice are important aspects of our work, it's a completely different conversation than if we make assumptions about what is the end goal here. So values and principles. And I would be really curious about what you guys think about that.
Yeah, just quickly, that is important to sort of lay that foundation, and then I think then you got to get really specific of like, all right, we're going to start here. This is our clear objective, and we're going to take it one step at a time and try to move the needle. So if you're using OKRs, like if you're like in the startup sort of mindset or otherwise, you got to get somewhere specific and show that we can move the needle X amount, and then that garners more attention and success because you're like, okay, you've demonstrated, now take the next step. And then always have that sort of, those values sort of foundational or at the top level, but absolutely.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I just want to respond real quick to say that we've found at Greater Good that leading with values has actually given us some power. When we say no to a project that doesn't meet our values, suddenly we find ourselves in a position of power. So in a sort of counterintuitive way, if you are really values first and really kind of putting out there, like our mission is to advance equity, our mission is social justice, and you end up saying no to a project that doesn't work for those values, suddenly you have decision-making power that you just fabricated out of thin air. It's amazing. And that can sort of move you along and kind of grow your maybe influence if we're not going to use the word power, because officially decision-making power at the federal government, I imagine, is a different matter. But influence is still very real and can certainly lead to power. Jorge, did you have a story or example you'd like to share about how you've shifted power?
Well, or at least again, attempting to do it. And I hope this doesn't sound as an ad or a kind of like a teaser, but we are running a workshop on power tomorrow as part of this conference, and already being involved with Sara's partner George and with Jessica Jacobs in the planning of the workshop already sort of like started to give me some opportunities to think through the process of design and how that is intimately involved with issues of power. So one of the projects in which I'm currently working on is a kind of like a service and platform design project for an organization in Mexico called Gentera, which is a financial inclusion organization. They basically provide financial services to underprivileged people. And I think in some ways already throughout the project, I had some important values in mind when working on the research and eventually the solution or the emerging solution to the project. And for example, one of them has been to, I mean, this is a long story, but one of the characteristics of the people that Gentera serves is that they form tight communities, even in financial terms. They operate not as kind of like financial individuals, but like communities. So one of our principles, and that has actually almost involved as designers to kind of like resist a little bit of the power that the institution could hold over these people, is to kind of like persuade our client to not break up these tightly knit financial communities that they form, rather instead going the other way to kind of like enrich and use that kind of social cohesion as a design principle and as a way to, I guess, also empower people. But then working throughout the design of the workshop, or actually working with George and Jessica, what was really helpful was to make more explicit the ways in which we as designers are also involved in these structures of power. So one of parts, step or stage in the project was to run a participatory co-design project. We had already done design research, but we did this participatory co-design project with young people from these communities, and then I realized that one of the ways in which we were sort of like not using our power as designers very responsibly is by basically recruiting these young people for the workshop and then just leaving them behind. So one of the ways in which I'm trying to sort of like empower them a little bit was to not leave them behind, but actually keep them on board throughout the project until the end. And one of the challenges that I found is that then their role or their status within the project is something difficult to manage with regards to the client, because I'm hired by the client, they pay me to work on these, whereas they receive some compensation for participating in projects. But what happens if they actually provide a really good concept, or even, and this is exactly something that happened, a really good name for a product, and how can I keep them involved? Are they now actually working as designers even if they are not professional designers? So how can I negotiate with the client to actually keep that person not just as a research subject or participant, but actually as part of the design team itself? So this is a very recent example. Again, not like a successful precisely, but one of these ongoing challenges that I'm facing.
It's a really important challenge, and I really want to talk to you more about that because we've had similar challenges and some ways to move past them. I do want to open up to questions. We have about 6 minutes left, and I know there's at least somebody in this room that wants to ask a question to at least one of our panelists. So any hands? Anyone have questions for our amazing group of impact makers? Yes.
Having among themselves, but it is certainly a challenge when the community begins to see itself not only as a stakeholder but also as a shareholder. And so when we start recognizing, yes, innovation can come from anywhere, but and we're talking about equity, but now we want to be innovators, or as the panel before, entrepreneurial in this. And there is this sense that the designer, will say, well, but I'm doing this, to help you. I'm doing this for school. I'm doing this as a research. I'm doing this whatever. And so this need to sort of stick it back is very uncomfortable. It creates a lot of friction. And I would, in this era of this mood of transparency, I have really been sticking it to my sister from another country, the other shy, Paola. I'm Paula, she's Paola. And so, interesting enough, we were having this dialogue a couple days ago on the phone, and I'm, really giving it to her and talking about, and this was a conference I would have liked to have come to or whatever. And she said, I made it possible. You didn't get the email or whatever? I said, no. And after I've done all of that, right? But I don't know, Paola, I want to put you on the spot because you have, as you say, you're across multidisciplines, and we just did this, 2 days ago on the phone. So while you're here with your peer group and we have others listening, I would really like to listen because you are an excellent listener. And I would like to really understand better what those challenges are. How do you feel when, I'm giving that pushback? And are we really being sensitive to this? Because, as I said to you, I feel like we have to overextend how it is from your perspective, and you're a good listener. But you also have been in, each one of these positions that the co-panelists are in. So would you be comfortable in just sharing what it's really like or how you're really feeling?
Can I add something?
And Eleanor, you would be on that end as well.
So whoever, if you'd like to go first, or you would like me to, okay. Sorry to get in the middle of this. Obviously, you two have a history. But I did want to add that Another important part, I think, of any type of public engagement is understanding the boundaries and the capabilities of everyone involved. And maybe, that's the mom in me coming out and saying that, but I think everyone needs to understand that government can't do everything, that the developer can't pay for everything. The community cannot necessarily be responsible for all the upkeep of the public space that they're giving us their input. So I think that is a good boundary setting at the beginning of a project to understand where everyone has influence, has power, has control, and financially can work on a project and contribute. So I'm hand this over to you, but I do find this is a tricky area to balance, this gray area of we want this, but there's no one there to catch it and give it to you. So I think that it's also understanding on all sides the limitations.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Eleanor. Geez. The way I think a lot of power, again, right? Redistribution of power. I have to premise that with I come from this canon of architecture where someone at some point decided that there was the single visionary driving decision-making process. I don't stand behind that, right? So a lot of my practice is collaborative. Collaborations are amazing. They're also exhausting. Just building the ground. But if you go through every single project in my portfolio as Borderless, it's a collaboration. And just committing to that, I think that's part of the value system that I've created. When collaborating with Paula in Bronzeville, when collaborating with Tonika in Englewood, there's always this process of engagement where I just have design tools. That's all I got. And I'm very transparent and honest. This is what I bring to the table. And for me, that has huge value. And my job is to say, this is what I got. This is how I can work with you. How can these things with my things and your things can add value and bring something together as a project. So I'm completely transparent. Design is my tool. Design is my expertise. Design broadly defined, I can design a process, I can design a space, I can design, something physical or something less tangential. So I'm really open and transparent. The other thing about architecture specifically is this idea of the outcome is the only thing that matters, and for me, that's also completely wrong. Process is equally important as outcome. So I hear you when process, building the process, designing the process. So these ongoing collaborations are never focused on the outcome. It's how can we use the process to leverage more support, to talk to this person, to just initiate and catalyze conversations about something we want to see happen. So I use a lot of whatever power I can have to give access. If I have access to a space, if I have access to a resource, the collaborators, the network of collaborators I built in the past are part of that strategy of access. So access to resources, access to information. It's, we would be very naive to say we all have access to everything. As a woman of color navigating a small business, I understand the inequities that come in the business world, in the social impact world. So, for me, a must is giving access whenever I have access to something.
Thank you. I know we're out of time, but I do want to just close with a quote that I think could sort of maybe capture a little bit of what this conversation has touched on and maybe speaks to some of the motivations of all of us for doing this work in the first place. I don't know if folks are familiar with Lilla Watson. She's an activist to an extent. The line is, I'm going to get it wrong, but it's basically, if you've come here to help me, you are wasting your time. If you have come here because you know that your destiny is entwined with mine, then let us work together. I think that's why we're in this space. I think that's why we do the work we do. And I think that it's a new space that designers can be in, and hopefully all of us are inspirational for you all to move towards that. Thank you all so much. We're going to close.